Hi, welcome to the Introduction to 3D Studio Max presented by 3dtotal.com. My name is Isaac Oster, and in this lesson I'm going to talk about the material editor, procedural textures, and a few utilities. So to open the material editor, you click on this icon right here, and there are two versions of this window that you can toggle between by clicking on the Modes button here. There's the Compact Material Editor, which is what this is, and the Slate Material Editor, which is a node-based editor that is similar to the Hypershade for Maya users out there. So let me just create a sphere. And I'm going to hit G to hide the grid. And I'm going to assign this material to this object. Now there's a couple of ways you can do that. You can click this icon right here, the Assign Material to Selection icon, or you can just drag and drop. So once I have this material assigned, I have some general options here. There's diffuse, so if I click this gray box I get a color picker, and as you see I click a color and it'll update here in the UI. And then there's a specular value, which is going to be the shininess. So that won't really change too much until I tweak these values here. So by default the specular level is set to 0. So if I just slowly raise this up, you can start to see a highlight forming here on the sphere, as well as a little bit of a backlight, rim light here on the edge. So there's the glossiness and soften. So what glossiness is going to do, and it's pretty apparent in the graph here, as I increase it, is it tightens up that highlight boundary. So I can increase or decrease the overall specular brightness with the specular level slider here, and the sharpness of that highlight can be tweaked using the glossiness. So at 100 it's a little pinprick as though it was a piece of hard plastic. And then as I drop this down, it turns into a broader highlight. Over here we have opacity, and opacity is just transparency, and as I reduce it you can see this is updating a little bit more quickly. And I'm going to switch to shaded mode here, and if I render it you can see, actually maybe I should duplicate this, and I'm going to assign another standard material to the sphere in the back and render it, and you can see the opacity is reduced. Self-illumination is going to be a glow. So it will be a little bit brighter, and the brightness will be independent of any lights in the scene. And if you'd like to turn on wireframe, you can do that right here. However, it won't render. Whoops, let me make the opacity 100. In order to get it to render, you need to go to the render setup and click force wireframe to be turned on. So if you're doing renders for your portfolio, that's a good thing to know. So one thing I want to mention, let me just so sometimes if you expand the map section, it'll actually scroll the window up so that you can see the entire thing. Just remember that there's this whole section up here that's available to you. You just need to click anywhere that isn't a button, and you can move this up and down. So I'll just turn wireframe off there, and maybe the self-illumination back to 0. So if I want to know what material is assigned to which object, there's a couple ways to do that. I can click on the object, and up here in the material editor, the applied material will get these little white triangles here in the corner, and they'll fill in. And if there are unfilled triangles, what that means is this is a material that exists and has been assigned. And if I click on this object, you can see these now become white and filled in. We also have a drop down here in the basic parameters. By default it's set to Blinn. Now Blinn is a type of material that has diffuse and some specular controls, but the specular highlight on a Blinn material is going to be round. some materials like silk or CDs actually have a directional highlight, and it's formed by lots of tiny grooves kind of going in the same direction. And to get to that, you need to click on the blend here and select anisotropic. So I'm going to preserve this one and do it to this. So I'm just going to do a drag and drop and select anisotropic from the drop down here. And it probably doesn't look a lot different from the blend initially, but as I increase the specular level, you begin to see here it's not updating in the workspace, but if I render it, you can see that highlight is becoming more linear. So let's just focus on this for the time being because it looks like that's updating a little bit more quickly. But if I increase the specular level and increase the anisotropy, it starts to get oh, also hair has this similar behavior. So that's a potentially very useful. If you want to change the direction of the highlight, you can tweak the orientation pretty easily. So there are some other shader presets here, different shader types, but blend and anisotropic are the two that I find to be the most useful. So I'm going to move on to the maps section. So these values here are basically 0 to whatever the top value is. So in the case of specular level, I guess that can just go on up to just about anything. But we can't add anything more specific in here other than just a single value. So either 0 to 100 or 0 to 255 or whatever the range happens to be. But if I want to have significantly more control, I have these options down here. So I'm going to go ahead and switch now to the Slate version, which again I'm going to get to by clicking on Modes and then open the Slate Material Editor. And to find the materials that we've already created, I can click on Material, Get All Scene Materials. And here they are. This is the anisotropic and the blend. So I'm just going to delete this and show you what's going on here. So if I double click the standard default material here, what I'm actually doing is selecting this material, and I can pick it using the eyedropper. So if I wasn't sure, we can just click this object and the material show up. So this should look familiar. The only difference is we're not seeing the other materials up here right now, and the reason is because they would sort of be arranged out here in this main workspace like this. So I have the maps that I can expand here, and they correlate to these maps here. And there is a long list here of different kinds of things that I can plug into these values to make potentially very, very complicated shader networks to get very specific results. But I'm just going to show you what a few of these do and how to edit them. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about what are called procedural textures. So what a procedural texture is a texture that's created by some kind of a math function. So I will just start by clicking on noise and dropping right here. And to plug it into my shader, I just need to click on this circle and drag out and attach it to the diffuse color. So what diffuse is going to be the main color. So let me just kind of rearrange things a little bit. Don't need this guy here. And I think we're already assigned. Yeah. Oops. So I have this noise on here, but it doesn't look any different in the workspace. So to turn the hardware shading for the materials textures on, you have to click this button right here. And it's only an option. It's grayed out unless I've got a material selected. So I'm just going to go ahead and select the material and then click the checkerboard here, and what we can see is there is now something on the surface of this the sphere, and if I render it, we can see that reflected here. So it doesn't really look very noisy, and the reason is because the noise settings need to be tweaked a little bit. So I can either click this button right here, or click the node itself. It takes me to the same place. So with the procedural textures, their behavior is based on the size of the object. So in this case, my size for the noise parameters is set to 25, which is pretty high. If I drop this down to 1, you can see the change pretty immediately here when I render it a little bit of a better result. And I can change the type of noise from regular to fractal. And this is just a preview. It's not usually going to be super accurate, but it'll give you an idea of where you're going. And then I can also choose turbulence. So you can see how each one has a little bit of a different effect. It kind of looks like spaghetti. And there are additional controls. I can tweak the range and different. Basically, these are ingredients that go into the math equation that creates the pattern, and you can just sort of change what the ingredients are, and you'll get a different result. So if I want to get rid of this, I can double-click on the standard material and right-click on the slot here and click clear, or I can just select both of these and hit delete. So, but before I do that, I want to talk about what this is. Every time you plug in a procedural, or really anything into any of these slots, you'll get this controller Bezier float. And what this is just the strength, the intensity, which is when it's set to 1.0 here, the equivalent is 100 over here in the amount. So if I reduce this to 50, what you see is this has now been shifted to 0.5, and the effect has been reduced to 50% of its original strength. So again, if I want to clear it, I can just click clear. That's a right mouse click over here, or you can select these and hit delete. Okay, so the next one I want to talk about here is gradient right here. So I can either drag and drop and then plug the output into the diffuse color, or I can click on the diffuse color button right here. It says none now, and select gradient from the options, and it gives the same effect. So if I double click on gradient, what you can see is there are 3 inputs. There's color 1, color 2, and color 3, and some additional params. And here in the expanded view, we've got color 1, color 2, and color 3, plus some additional parameters. So what's going on here is the top of the color 1, or the top of the sphere is being assigned to color 1, and then there's a smooth gradient to color 2, which is middle gray, and then the bottom of the sphere is white, which we can see here. So if I want to tweak the values of these colors, I can click there and grab something different, and you can see the change. Grab the white one, and we'll make this one blue. So you can see the transition from color 1 to color 3. I can change the gradient type from linear to radial. And I can add some noise. So I'm just going to go ahead and turn the noise amount up a little bit, and you can see how it begins to blend those values together. I can choose a different noise type of fractal and turbulence. So you can see very different different results here. And naturally you can tweak all the these other little parameters here, phase and levels. So gradient is fairly useful, but it's limited to only 3 options. So if you wanted a ramp that had more gradient colors available to you, you would want to choose the gradient ramp. So I'm just going to go ahead and select the gradient node and delete it, and drag gradient ramp onto the workspace here and connect the output to the diffuse color. And here we see we've got 4 different controllers. So if I expand this, each one of these correlates to a position here on the ramp. So this one is set to the 0 position, this one's set to the 1 position, this one's set to the 0.5 position, and then this one is the middle value. So if I grab this arrow, you can see that middle one swinging up and down. So I'll just make sure you set to 0.05 for now, or sorry, 0.5. And if I want to change these colors, now what I need to do is click the little green arrow, give it a couple clicks, and we can go ahead and change these to whatever we want. But now what I can do, is just click anywhere else in here and create additional points. So there are some additional controls with the gradient type here, and I think it might be a little bit more apparent if I use a plane for this. So I'm going to keep the sphere and assign the material to this plane. So this is the linear gradient type, and if I select 4 corner, a little bit of a different result. Box, that one's pretty obvious what it's doing there. Diagonal, linear, which is I think was the default. Pong, radial, spiral, sweep, and tartan. And there's one that I didn't mention, normal. So most of these are actually looking at the UVs, which for the plane go from 0, 0 to 1, 1. So it's pretty obvious what most of these are doing, but what normal does is it actually looks at the normal direction of the faces. So the most obvious way to see what's going on here, I don't need the plane anymore, and I'm actually going to just make a new gradient map here, gradient ramp. And in this case, I'm going to plug it into the self-illumination tab, which again is sort of like lighting without light. Let's scoot these over a little bit. Open up the gradient settings, and I'm going to make the one on the left white, and then these two will be black. And I'm going to select normal. So what this is going to do is it's looking at the surface, the normal vectors, which is a perpendicular vector coming off of each face, really each pixel of the surface. And if it is pointing 90 degrees away from the camera, it will take this value, and if it's pointing directly at the camera coming off the surface this way, it'll take this value. So with this, the result of this is, if you render it out, you get a little bit of a rim light there. Let me zoom in a little bit. So if I increase this, the effect is going to be this white band around the outside of the sphere will get thicker, as you can see here. So if you need a little rim lighting, or you have a planet and you want to give it a little bit of a sense of atmosphere, this is a good way to do it. Okay, now I'm going to show you just a couple more of these procedurals. The first one will be cellular. So you can see the cell pattern there. This is good for simulating leather as well if you need to do that. And the next one can be pearl and marble, which looks kind of like a marble countertop. And smoke. And it's pretty dark by default, so the lighter value isn't actually set all the way to white, and then there's this exponent here, and if you reduce that a little bit, it'll brighten it up. So all of these have you know, their own components that you can get in and tinker with, and you get a lot more variety in the appearance. So here's speckle. And we can change the size and the color. So what if we wanted to combine some of these? There is a map here called a composite, and it works pretty much the same way. Just plug the output into the diffuse color. But now I have these layers. So for the first layer, I can click right here in the None section, and it'll bring up my normal normal pattern here. This little list of maps. So for this one, I will put a ramp in. And you can see it showing up there like we expect. But I'm going to add a new layer here with this button right here, add layer. And with this one, let's see, we can put let's put a smoke in there. So if I were to render this, it's basically just going to show that smoke because the opacity of this top layer is set to 100%. And I'm going to make this a little bit more obvious here by changing some of these colors. So we're still going to see just the smoke, but if I hop back over to the composite and reduce the opacity, say 50% for this top one, do a new render, now we can see the smoke and the ramp are being combined together. So that's a good way to combine these, and you can have as many as you want, and the opacities can be set to whatever they need to be set to. If you want to delete, it's this button right here, and you have additional control with the mask feature right here. So if you wanted to add a mask, you could do it with no problem right over here. So the next thing I want to show you is color correction. So if you are familiar with Photoshop, this this node has a lot of the same functionality that you might get from Photoshop in terms of the ability to tweak hue and saturation, or you know, you can invert the colors. So I'm just going to double click the color correction node, and what I need to do is apply a bitmap. So what a bitmap is pretty much any image. Max is pretty comfortable with a lot of different file formats. You can have PSDs or JPEGs or Targas or TIFFs or all kinds of stuff. So I'm going to plug the output of the bitmap into the input of the map of the color correction here, and this is what I get. So I can click invert, and it'll invert the colors. I can do a monochrome, and it'll desaturate them. I can do a hue shift, or saturation, little brighter, a little darker. So this could be a nice way to make modifications to a texture if you don't have access to Photoshop, or you just want to make a quick tweak on the fly here in Max. So we've talked about what a lot of these standard maps do, these procedurals and the color correction utility, and most of them have been in the context of the diffuse color slot here. But I want to show you what the specular color and specular level do. Now we briefly touched on them at the beginning of the lesson up here, where you can increase the level or the color right here. So, but you can also control those slots with maps. So I've created a gradient and given it a color range, and I'm just going to plug it directly into the specular color, and the result is it looks like a gray sphere. And the reason is we haven't given it any level yet. So if I just increase this, what we'll see is that highlight in there, and it is taking on the characteristics of the ramp that we've applied to it. So if I want to control this pattern here and make it a little more, add a little more variety, I can use the smoke and plug this into the specular level. So the level is basically the intensity of the specular highlight. So with this applied, we can see the effect there. So you can add a lot of interesting variety to your specular maps, make them feel a little bit dirtier or more natural with the inclusion of some kind of a noise procedural on the specular level. So the next thing I'd like to talk about is this section right here called bump. What a bump map is a grayscale image that you apply to an object that will actually change the way the surface lights. It doesn't change the geometry, but it creates the appearance of more surface detail. So I'm just going to do a quick render of this sphere, and we can see the edge here is very faceted and the inside is very smooth. So if I apply a smoke procedural to the bump section and reduce the size a little bit and do another render, you can see all this extra detail in here that isn't actually changing the geometry. It's just changing the way the geometry is lighting. So this is an excellent technique for creating the appearance of cloth or wood grain or any other kind of fine surface detail without actually having to create that detail in the geometry itself. To tweak the intensity of the bump map, all you need to do is change this value right here. By default, bump maps are set to 30. So if I make this 100, what we'll see is a much more rough surface. And if I drop it down to 5, it'll become a lot more subtle. So one of the limitations of using a grayscale image as a bump map is it doesn't show up in a real-time environment such as the Max workspace or a game engine. It only shows up using a software render such as Default Scanline or Mental Ray. In order to get that same high poly look on a low poly asset in a real-time environment, what we need to use is called a normal map. And in order to tell Max that what it's dealing with is a normal map, we need to use this normal bump utility here and plug that directly into the bump map slot, like this. And then to apply the texture, we just need to click on this normal section right here and select bitmap. Select the normal map and hit OK. So we don't see any difference right now, and the reason is we need to enable high quality rendering. And the way that you do that is by clicking the checkerboard here and holding it down. And the second option here has blue checkers as opposed to black checkers. And then the other thing we need to do is increase the value to 100. Normal maps are created procedurally, that is automatically, using a projection method called render to texture in the case of Max, where you have a high poly model and a low poly model, and you can create a map that captures the difference between those two models, which is the normal map. So I'm just going to hop over and show you what that looks like. So rather than using a grayscale image where black pushes in and white pushes up, what a normal map uses is actually a 3-channel image. So you get much more fine control over the actual direction that each pixel is pointing. So this is just an approximation, but you can think of it this way, that the red vector goes this way, and the green vector goes this way, and the blue vector is intensity, so that's actually the up and down value. So you're able to get a very accurate representation of how that surface would light were it the high poly geometry without actually having to pay for all those polygons. And that efficiency is precisely why it's such a popular technique for use in video games. So I just so happen to have the other textures for this asset, so I'll go and plug them in. I've got a diffuse map, and I can just plug a bitmap directly in here. I don't need to use a normal bump, because this is just a color texture. And I have a spec map as well. This goes into the specular level section. Again, just a regular bitmap is fine. And so with these 3 maps, you can begin to create a fairly realistic looking asset. And in an actual game shader, it gets a little bit more complicated, but for the purposes of this tutorial, I think this is sufficient. So that about does it for this episode on the Material Editor, Procedural Textures, and Utilities. I hope you found it to be informative. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more 3D Studio Max tutorials from 3dtotal.com.